The maid sat beside the millionaire in silence, and he finally spoke about his father. The grandfather clock in Marcus Thornfield's study chimed 11 times, each note echoing through the cavernous Manhattan penthouse like a countdown to solitude. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled with 10 million dreams, but inside, the silence pressed down like lead. Marcus sat hunched over his mahogany desk, the blue glow of his laptop screen casting harsh shadows across his weathered face. At 58, he commanded an empire worth $3 billion, yet tonight, he felt poorer than the homeless man he'd passed on Fifth Avenue that morning. The quarterly report sprawled before him showed another record-breaking year, but the numbers felt as cold as the marble floors beneath his Italian leather shoes. The sound of soft footsteps made him look up. Elena Vasquez moved through the room with practiced quiet, her slight frame carrying a silver tray bearing his usual evening tea. She'd worked for him for 7 years, arriving each morning at 6 and departing at sunset, maintaining the pristine emptiness of his world with meticulous care. "Your chamomile tea, Mr. Thornfield," she said in accented English, setting the tray on the side table. Her voice carried the warmth of her native Guatemala, a gentleness that seemed out of place in his sterile domain. Marcus nodded without looking at her, his fingers still dancing across the keyboard. "Thank you, Elena. You can go home now." But she didn't leave. Instead, she lingered by the window, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights. Something in her posture made him pause his typing. "Is everything all right?" he asked, surprised by his own concern for her well-being. Elena turned, and he saw something he'd never noticed before, a deep sadness that mirrored his own. "I received news today. Mr. Thornfield, my father, he passed away this morning in Guatemala City." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, an unexpected ache. He closed his laptop and really looked at Elena for the first time in years. She was probably in her 40s, with prematurely gray streaks threading through her black hair and hands weathered by decades of caring for others' homes, while her own family remained thousands of miles away. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the corporate condolence feeling inadequate. "Take whatever time you need." Elena nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. He was a good man. A carpenter. He built houses for families who couldn't afford much, but he said every family deserved walls that would protect them from the storms. The metaphor struck Marcus like a physical blow. He thought of his own father, dead now for 30 years, and the walls he'd spent his lifetime building, not to protect others, but to protect himself. That night, after Elena had gone, Marcus stood at his window looking out at the city. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to remember the sound of his father's voice, rough from cigarettes and disappointment, always promising that someday things would be different. But different had come too late, and now Marcus carried the weight of success like a stone in his chest. Chapter 2. Echoes in Empty Rooms. The next morning arrived gray and cold, November's breath fogging the windows of the penthouse. Marcus had barely slept, haunted by dreams of wooden houses and disappointed fathers. He found himself in the kitchen at dawn, something he never did, watching the coffee maker gurgle to life. Elena arrived precisely at 6, as always. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but determined, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had learned to bear grief without complaint. "You don't have to be here today," Marcus said, as she hung her coat in the service closet. "Work helps," she replied simply. "My father taught me that idle hands give the heart too much time to break." They moved through the morning in their usual choreography, she cleaning, he pretending to work while actually watching her. He noticed things he'd never seen before, how she touched the family photographs on his mantel with gentle fingers, how she hummed softly while polishing the silver, how she paused at the window to watch the pigeons on the fire escape across the street. By afternoon, the penthouse gleamed, but the silence felt different somehow. Marcus found himself following Elena from room to room, ostensibly checking emails on his phone, but really just seeking the comfort of another human presence. In the library, she was dusting the leather-bound volumes he'd never read, purchased by his interior designer to project intelligence and culture. Elena pulled out a worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude and smiled. "This was my father's favorite book," she said. "He read it to me when I was young, even though I didn't understand it then." "What did you understand?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. Elena considered this, running her fingers along the book's spine. "That stories connect us across time, that the love we give and receive echoes through generations, even when we can't hear it anymore." Marcus felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his heart. He thought of his own father, who had worked 3 jobs to pay for Marcus's business school, who had died of a heart attack 2 weeks before Marcus made his first million. There had been no time for stories between them, only the grinding necessity of survival. That evening, as Elena prepared to leave, Marcus did something unprecedented. Would you like some tea before you go? You don't have to clean up after." Elena looked at him with surprise and something that might have been compassion. "Yes, Mr. Thornfield, I would like that very much." They sat in the living room, the city lights painting patterns on the walls, each sipping tea in a silence that felt less lonely than usual. Marcus wanted to ask about her father, about Guatemala, about the life she'd left behind to clean his empty rooms, but the words felt too big, too dangerous to speak aloud. Instead, they sat together as the night deepened, 2 people carrying their separate griefs in the same shared space. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. 3 days later, Marcus canceled his morning meetings. He told his assistant he was coming down with something, which wasn't entirely untrue. He was coming down with a case of profound restlessness that no amount of work could cure. Elena found him in the study, staring at a framed photograph he'd pulled from his desk drawer. The picture showed a younger Marcus with a tall, thin man in a flannel shirt and work boots. His father, Robert Thornfield, taken the day Marcus had graduated from Columbia Business School. "He looks proud," Elena said softly, settling into her cleaning routine around him. "He was dying," Marcus replied, his voice rough. "And the heart attack was 6 months later, but the doctors said he'd been sick for years. Too stubborn to see a doctor? Too poor to take time off work?" Elena paused in her dusting. "Did he know about your success?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He knew I was making money, but I don't think he understood what kind of person I was becoming to make it." The admission hung between them like a confession. Marcus had never spoken these words aloud, not to his therapist, not to his ex-wife, not to anyone. But something about Elena's presence, steady, non-judgmental, grieving her own father, made the truth feel possible. "What kind of person?" she asked, not looking at him as she continued her work. Marcus set down the photograph. "Cold, calculating. I fired 300 people last month to boost quarterly profits. I've destroyed small businesses, bought out family companies, turned everything I touch into numbers on a spreadsheet." He paused. "I became everything he would have hated." Elena moved to the window, looking out at the city below. "My father used to say that we become what we think we need to survive, but sometimes we survive the danger and forget to stop being afraid." The words hit Marcus like a revelation. He thought of the scared young man he'd been, desperate to escape the poverty that had killed his father, willing to do anything to never feel that powerless again. Somewhere along the way, the fear had calcified into ambition, and ambition into ruthlessness. "I haven't been back to his grave in 15 years, Marcus whispered. Elena turned from the window. For the first time since she'd worked for him, she looked directly into his eyes. "Why?" The question was simple, but it opened a floodgate. "Because I'm ashamed. Because he raised me to help people, and I've spent 30 years doing the opposite. Because I made a fortune, but I lost my soul, and he would see that the moment I walked up to his headstone, tears he hadn't shed in decades burned behind his eyes." Elena set down her cleaning supplies, and in a gesture that broke every boundary of their professional relationship, sat down in the chair across from his desk. "Tell me about him," she said. "Not about his death, about his life." And for the first time in 30 years, Marcus began to remember not the disappointment in his father's eyes, but the love. Chapter 4. Breaking open. The rain came that afternoon like a benediction, washing the city clean and turning the penthouse into a sanctuary of gray light and gentle sound. Marcus had been talking for 2 hours, and Elena had been listening with the kind of attention that felt like prayer. He told her about Robert Thornfield, who had immigrated from Ireland with nothing but calloused hands and a fierce belief that America rewarded honest work, who had taught Marcus to fix engines in their tiny one-car garage behind their cramped apartment in Queens, patient with his clumsy 8-year-old fingers and encouraging every curious question, who had worked construction during the day and drove a taxi at night, coming home with shoulders bent from exhaustion, but always finding energy to help Marcus with his homework. "He used to bring me candy bars," Marcus said, his voice soft with memory. "These terrible generic ones from the corner store, because that's all he could afford. But he'd present them to me like they were gold bars, you know? Like I was worth something precious. He'd unwrap them with such ceremony, telling me I'd earned it for getting good grades, for helping around the house, for just being his son." Elena smiled, her hands folded in her lap as she listened. What was his dream for you? He wanted me to be a teacher. Marcus laughed, but this time there was warmth in it. Said teachers shaped the future, that there was no more important work in the world. He had this old encyclopedia set that he'd bought secondhand, and he'd make me read him articles every night after dinner. He couldn't read very well himself, had to quit school at 14 to work, but he believed education was the key to everything. Marcus paused, staring at his hands. He used to practice my presentations for business school with me, even though he didn't understand half the words I was using. He'd sit in our tiny living room, wearing his best shirt, the one he saved for church, and listen to me talk about market analysis and corporate strategy like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. He was so proud when I got accepted to Columbia. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat. Elena rose and made more tea, moving around the kitchen with quiet efficiency while Marcus continued to unpack memories he'd buried for decades. When she returned, she brought a plate of simple cookies she'd found in his barely used pantry, arranging them with the same care she brought to everything else. Tell me about the last time you saw him, she said gently, settling back into her chair. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his teacup. It was at the hospital. He'd had the first heart attack. A small one, the doctors said. I was closing a major deal that week, one that would make me my first real money. I remember being furious that I had to leave the office, angry that he'd chosen that moment to get sick. His voice broke slightly. I walked into that sterile hospital room, and he looked so small in that bed. This man, who had always seemed invincible to me, who had carried me on his shoulders, who had worked 18-hour days without complaint, he looked fragile, and the first thing he said wasn't about his pain or his fear. He asked me about the deal. He wanted to know if I was going to be successful. Elena remained silent, but her presence felt like an anchor as Marcus navigated these treacherous waters of memory. I told him about the money I'd make, about the opportunities it would open up, and he smiled, this proud, tired smile, and said, "Just remember, son, money is just a tool. The measure of a man isn't what he accumulates, but what he builds with what he has." I thought he meant buildings, businesses, something tangible, but now I think he meant relationships, community, something lasting. And what have you built? Elena asked gently. Marcus looked around his pristine penthouse, with its expensive furniture and tasteful art and complete absence of anything that mattered. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, creating an intimate cocoon around them. Walls, he said finally. I built walls so high that nothing could get in to hurt me, but nothing could get out either. I built a fortress and trapped myself inside it. Elena set her teacup down with careful precision. My father built walls too, Mr. Thornfield. The houses he constructed for families in our village, they had strong walls to protect against storms and rain, but his walls had doors and windows, and he always made space for a garden, for children to play, for neighbors to gather. He said a wall without an opening wasn't protection, it was a prison. The metaphor hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought of all the relationships he'd sacrificed on the altar of success, colleagues he'd betrayed, friends he'd abandoned when they were no longer useful, the wife who had loved him once, but couldn't compete with his ambition. I destroyed everything good in my life, he whispered. My marriage ended because I was never present, even when I was in the same room. My son grew up with a father who scheduled quality time like business meetings. I have acquaintances, business associates, people who fear me or want something from me, but I can't remember the last time someone looked at me the way you're looking at me right now. How am I looking at you? Elena asked softly. Like I'm human, like I matter for something other than what I can provide or achieve. They sat in the growing darkness, the rain continuing its gentle percussion against the glass. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a loosening in his chest, as if some tightly wound spring was finally beginning to uncoil. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was full of understanding, of shared grief, of the fragile beginning of connection. I don't know how to change, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been this person for so long. I don't even know if there's anything else left underneath all the armor I've built. Elena leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights. In Guatemala, we have a saying, El río que no se mueve se convierte en pantano. The river that doesn't move becomes a swamp. But you're still moving, Mr. Thornfield. You're talking, you're remembering, you're feeling. That's the first step. As the evening deepened into night, Marcus found himself telling Elena things he'd never told anyone, about the nightmares that still plagued him, where his father stood at the edge of his consciousness, shaking his head in disappointment. About the ex-wife, Sarah, who had left him because she said living with him was like living with a beautiful ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. About his son, David, now 28 and working for a non-profit in Seattle, who had stopped calling years ago because every conversation became a business negotiation, every piece of advice a lecture on maximizing potential. The worst part, Marcus said, his voice raw from talking, is that I know exactly when I became this person. It was the day after my father's funeral. I was standing in his apartment, looking at his few possessions, books held together with tape, clothes worn thin from washing, a small wooden box where he kept newspaper clippings about my business successes, and I made a promise to myself that I would never be vulnerable like that again. Never poor, never powerless, never dependent on anyone else for anything. He paused, staring at the rain streaming down the windows. I kept that promise, but in keeping it, I lost everything that actually mattered. Elena listened to it all, this woman who cleaned his floors and polished his emptiness, who had lost her own father and understood the weight of unspoken love, the burden of regret that could crush a soul if carried alone. She didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. She simply bore witness to his pain with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else. When she finally rose to leave, the clock showing well past 10, Marcus felt a panic he hadn't experienced since childhood. The thought of returning to his usual solitude felt unbearable now, after hours of genuine human connection. Elena, he called as she reached for her coat. Thank you for listening, for seeing me, for not running away when I showed you who I really am. She turned back, her kind eyes bright with unshed tears. We all need to be seen, Mr. Thornfield, even millionaires, especially millionaires. And what I see is a man who loved his father enough to carry his disappointment for 30 years. That's not the heart of a cold person. That's the heart of someone who cares so much it hurts. As she reached for the door, she paused one more time. My father used to say that the deepest wounds often come from the deepest love. Your father's opinion mattered to you because his love mattered to you. That love is still there, Mr. Thornfield. It's been waiting for you to come home to it. After she left, Marcus stood in his empty penthouse, but for the first time in decades, the emptiness didn't feel like defeat. It felt like possibility. Chapter 5. The Dawn of Something New. Marcus woke before sunrise the next morning, something that hadn't happened in years unless demanded by business. But this wasn't about business. This was about something far more important. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling as the first pale light of dawn crept through his bedroom windows, and for the first time in decades, he felt something that resembled hope. He dressed carefully, not in his usual armor of expensive suits, but in jeans and a simple navy sweater Sarah had bought him years ago during one of their rare peaceful moments. He'd kept it in the back of his closet, unworn, a relic of the man he might have been if he'd made different choices. When Elena arrived at 6, she found him in the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast for 2. The results were charitably described as enthusiastic rather than successful. Scrambled eggs that looked more like abstract art, coffee that could strip paint, and toast that ranged from barely warmed to charcoal. But she smiled when she saw the effort, recognizing it for what it was, a gesture of respect, an attempt to serve rather than be served. I've been thinking all night, he said without preamble, his hands still clutching a spatula like a weapon he didn't know how to use. About what you said, about rivers and movement, about walls with doors. Elena hung up her coat and surveyed the mild disaster he'd made of her pristine kitchen. Instead of her usual efficient cleaning routine, she moved to stand beside him at the stove, gently taking the spatula from his hands. And what did you decide? I want to visit my father's grave. Today. And I was hoping. He paused, vulnerability flickering across his features like candlelight. Would you come with me? I know it's not part of your job, and I know I have no right to ask, but I don't think I can do this alone. The request surprised them both. Elena studied his face, seeing something there she'd never seen before. Hope, fragile and new, but unmistakably real. This powerful man who commanded boardrooms and influenced markets was asking her, his housekeeper, to accompany him on the most important journey of his adult life. Yes, she said simply, her voice warm with understanding. I would be honored. Before they left, Marcus did something that would have seemed impossible just days before. He called his assistant and canceled everything, the board meeting, the conference call with Tokyo, the lunch with potential investors. For the first time in his career, he chose presence over profit. The drive to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx took them through neighborhoods Marcus had forgotten existed, places where his father had once walked and worked and dreamed. They drove through Queens, past the apartment building where Marcus had grown up, now converted into upscale condos, past the corner store where his father had bought those terrible candy bars, now a trendy coffee shop with prices that would have horrified Robert Thornfield. Elena sat quietly beside him in the passenger seat of his rarely used car, not one of his expensive sports cars, but a simple sedan he'd bought years ago and forgotten about. Her presence was a steady comfort as he navigated not just the unfamiliar streets, but the unfamiliar territory of his own emotions. "Tell me about your father's funeral," Elena said gently, as they sat in traffic. "You mentioned it yesterday, but you didn't talk about how it felt." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter. "It was raining, just like yesterday. I remember standing there in my brand new black suit, the most expensive suit I'd ever owned, surrounded by his friends from work, his neighbors, people I barely knew but who knew him better than I did by then. They all had stories about him, about how he'd helped them fix their cars, or lent them money when times were tough, or just been there when they needed someone to listen." He paused, watching a young father help his small daughter across the crosswalk. "I realized that day that I was the only person there who didn't have a story about Robert Thornfield's kindness. I was his son, but I'd been so focused on making him proud through my achievements that I'd never learned to know him as a person." They resumed driving, the city slowly transforming around them from the polished wealth of Manhattan to the working-class neighborhoods of the Bronx. After the funeral, people came up to me and said things like, "He was so proud of you, and he talked about your success all the time." But what they meant was that he talked about my potential, my future, because by then, I was already becoming someone he couldn't quite recognize. Elena nodded, understanding the weight of regret he carried. "It's never too late to become the person he raised you to be," she said softly. Woodlawn Cemetery stretched before them like a city of stone, thousands of graves marking thousands of lives lived and lost. Robert Thornfield's grave was in the older section, among other working-class immigrants who had come to America seeking better lives for their children. The headstone was simpler than Marcus remembered, just a modest granite marker with his father's name, dates, and a single line, "Beloved father and friend." Marcus stood there for a long moment, the words he'd rehearsed during the sleepless night dissolving on his tongue. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena knelt and placed a small bouquet of flowers, white daisies from the bodega near the penthouse, simple and honest, like the man they'd come to honor. "Start with hello," she suggested, rising to stand beside him. And so Marcus did. He told his father about the business, about the empire he'd built, and the enemies he'd made along the way. He talked about the success that had come at such a high price, about the $3 billion that couldn't buy him a single genuine relationship. He spoke about Sarah, about how he'd loved her, but hadn't known how to show it without trying to control it. About David, their son, who had his grandfather's kind eyes and gentle heart, qualities Marcus had tried to toughen out of him instead of nurturing. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, as if a dam had burst. He apologized for becoming everything his father had never wanted him to be, for choosing fear over love, power over connection. He confessed his loneliness, his regret, his desperate wish that he could go back and make different choices. "I fired 300 people last month, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "Good people with families, people who reminded me of you. I told myself it was business, that it was necessary for growth, but the truth is I've forgotten how to see people as anything other than numbers on a spreadsheet. I've forgotten how to care about anything other than winning." Elena stood beside him in supportive silence, her presence an anchor in the storm of his emotions. Other visitors moved quietly through the cemetery, each carrying their own burden of love and loss. But Marcus felt utterly alone with his father's memory. "I don't know how to be the man you raised me to be," he whispered. "I don't even know if that man still exists inside me somewhere." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of children playing in a nearby park. Marcus thought of himself at that age, sitting on his father's shoulders, believing that the world was full of possibility and that his father was the strongest man alive. "He does exist," Elena said softly, reading his thoughts. "I've seen him these past few days. He's the man who noticed my grief, who asked about my father, who stayed up all night remembering love instead of counting money. He's the man who made breakfast this morning, who canceled his meetings to come here, who's crying for the first time in 30 years. Your father would see that man, Mr. Thornfield. He would be proud of your courage to come here today. When the words finally stopped coming, Marcus found himself crying for the first time since the funeral 30 years ago. Not the controlled, silent tears of a businessman maintaining his composure, but the raw, healing sobs of a son who had finally come home to his grief. On the drive back to Manhattan, Marcus made a series of decisions that would have seemed impossible a week ago. "Elena," he said as they merged onto the highway, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no without any consequences for your job." She nodded, waiting. "I want to change how I do business. I want to find ways to build instead of just accumulate, to help instead of just profit. But I need help, not just with cleaning my house, but with cleaning up my life. Would you consider being my advisor, my conscience, if you will? I'll triple your salary, give you an office, whatever you need. I need someone who sees me as human, to help me remember how to be human." Elena was quiet for so long that Marcus began to worry he'd overstepped, that he'd made the same mistake he always made of trying to solve problems with money. Finally, she spoke, her voice thoughtful and measured. "My father always said that the measure of a person isn't their mistakes, but what they do after they realize they've made them. He also said that the best teacher is someone who has walked the path you want to walk." She paused, looking out at the city skyline growing larger before them. "I'll help you, Mr. Thornfield, but not as your employee, as your friend, because friendship can't be bought, only given." The word friend hit Marcus like a revelation. When was the last time someone had offered him friendship without expecting something in return? When was the last time he had valued anything that couldn't be quantified or leveraged? "I'd like that," he said, and meant it more than any business deal he'd ever closed. The changes didn't happen overnight. Marcus couldn't undo 30 years of ruthless business practices with a single decision or transform a lifetime of emotional isolation with one conversation. But he began, slowly and with Elena's gentle guidance, to find ways to align his success with his father's values. He started small, really listening when his assistant spoke, learning the names of the cleaning crew in his office building, asking about their families. He established a foundation for the children of immigrants, remembering his father's belief in education as the great equalizer. He implemented profit-sharing programs in his companies, sharing success instead of hoarding it. Most importantly, he called David. The conversation was awkward at first, 30 years of distance not easily bridged, but his son's voice on the other end of the line sounded like grace. They talked for 2 hours, about everything and nothing, about regrets and possibilities, about the grandfather David remembered only in fragments, but loved completely. "I'd like to visit Grandpa's grave with you sometime," David said before they hung up. "If you'd want that." "I'd like that very much," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. Elena became not just his advisor, but his guide back to his own humanity. She helped him understand that strength could be gentle, that success could serve others, that vulnerability was not weakness, but the foundation of every meaningful connection. 6 months later, Marcus stood in his study, watching Elena arrange fresh flowers, daisies like the ones they'd brought to his father's grave, in a simple vase on his desk. The room looked the same, but everything was different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, of connection, of the slow but steady work of rebuilding a life worth living. His relationship with David was still fragile, still being rebuilt one careful conversation at a time. But it was real now in a way it had never been before. Sarah had even called, surprised by the changes she saw in their son's reports about his father. "You sound different," she'd said, and there was something like hope in her voice. The business was changing too. Profits were down slightly, but employee satisfaction was at an all-time high. The foundation was funding scholarships for dozens of immigrant children. His companies were known now not just for their efficiency, but for their humanity. "Elena," he said, and she looked up with the warm smile that had become as essential to his days as sunlight. "Thank you." "For what, Mr. Thornfield?" "For sitting with me in the silence, for helping me find my voice again, for showing me that it's never too late to come home to who you're meant to be." She smiled, returning to her flowers. "We all need someone to sit with us in the silence sometimes. That's what makes us human." Outside the windows, the city hummed with 10 million stories of struggle and hope, of people trying to build lives worth living in a world that often felt too hard and too cold. But inside the penthouse, Two friends who had found each other across the divide of class and culture and grief continued the quiet work of healing, one conversation at a time. Marcus returned to his laptop, but the numbers on the screen looked different now. They weren't just profits and losses. They were opportunities to build the kind of legacy his father would have been proud of. And in the gentle sound of Elena's humming as she worked, he heard an echo of his father's voice, reminding him that the best walls were the ones with doors, and the greatest wealth was the love we give and receive. That evening, as Elena prepared to leave for the day, Marcus looked up from his work. Same time tomorrow, she confirmed. But now it felt less like an appointment and more like a promise between friends. The story of the millionaire and his maid wasn't really about money at all. It was about the courage to be vulnerable, the power of being truly heard, and the remarkable things that can happen when we finally let someone sit with us in our silence. It was about remembering that success without love is just a beautiful kind of failure, and that the most valuable treasures can't be counted, only felt. Most of all, it was about coming home, not to a place, but to the person we were always meant to be. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share where you're listening from in the comments below. Remember, we all have the power to change, to connect, and to choose love over fear. Until next time, may you find the courage to let someone sit with you in your silence too.